Good morning and good afternoon. Hello and welcome to today's webinar series of the Visa Threat Intelligence. Our first one today is the retail industry. My name is Sylvia Young. I'm a member of Visa's North America Merchant Risk Team, and I'll be moderating today's event. Next, I'd like to remind you that the information in today's webinar is intended for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon for operational, marketing, technical, legal, or any other advice. So today we have Glenn Jones and Kevin Thompson. Glenn is the head of payment system cyber intelligence for Visa. He manages a threat intelligence and an awareness program here focused on cyber threats to the Visa payment ecosystem. He's got about 20 years of experience in corporate information security, cyber investigations, digital forensics, as well as ethical hacking. Kevin Thompson joins us today from FireEye. He's a threat analyst there. In his current role, Kevin educates FireEye customers and partners on the latest cyber threats to their infrastructure. Prior to FireEye, Kevin worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, and some of his work has rose to the level of the presidential daily briefings. We've got a lot of materials to go through today, so without further ado, I'm going to pass this over to Kevin to get us started. Kevin, take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending the webinar today. My name is Kevin Thompson, and for the first part of this webinar, I'm going to talk about some of the specific threats that we had seen from a FireEye perspective that's targeting the retail industry. We'll also talk about some of the ways that organizations are using threat intelligence and ways that they can look for better threat intelligence. And then we'll talk specifically about some of the groups that we see targeting retail organizations. And then after that, I'll pass it over to Glenn so we can get a Visa perspective on what they're seeing when it comes to attacks targeting the retail organization. So please feel free, if you have any questions as you go through, please enter them into the Q&A chat window, and we'll be happy to answer them towards the end of this presentation. So from a FireEye perspective, we had worked with a lot of retail organizations. In the last 6 months to a year, a lot of the retail organizations were really starting to get interested in using threat intelligence, sort of getting some information to help them understand what the threats were facing their organization, who the attackers were, and what sort of tools that the attackers were using. The problem that we saw is that more and more companies started to invest and sort of look into this idea of threat intelligence. What they ended up getting, there was two problems that they started to see as they dived more and more into the threat intelligence area. The first thing, the problem that we saw, is organizations thought that they were getting threat intelligence when they were actually just getting raw data. They were getting bulk data, they were signing up for feeds, or they were signing up for subscriptions, and they were getting this raw data. It wasn't really curated threat intelligence. And the problem with this raw data is it was missing the threats that were matter. The information that they were getting was very commoditized, and it was very broad. It was about all the different attacks that were going on in different industries from different countries and different organizations targeting different size companies. And a lot of the information was out of date. So they might be getting information about an IP address or a domain or a signature about a tool, but the attackers haven't used that IP address or used that domain within the last month or 6 months or 3 months or whatever. So the information that they were getting was out of date. It wasn't really helping them protect against specific targeted attacks against their organization. And it also, over time, it became part of the problem. A lot of the times organizations were looking to get more information through threat intelligence. And the reason they were looking to get threat intelligence is because they were either understaffed or didn't have the funding or didn't have the people within their organization to build threat intelligence internally. So signing up for these different threat intelligence feed became part of the problem because the amount of information that they were getting was overwhelming them even more. So instead of 100 alerts, now they're having 200 or 300 different types of alerts that they were having to go through. So the amount of data they were getting actually made it more difficult for them to figure out what were the threats targeting their organization. Where on the flip side, good threat intelligence should take that information, that highly curated data sources, and help you to create and understand the precise alerts that are targeting your specific organization. What's going on in your industry? What are the things that should be targeting your organization? It should, in the long term, it should help you right-size the problem. It should help you be able to prioritize the attacks that you're seeing. So if you may be having 100 or 200 different alerts on your security tools, and you know that these 3 or 4 are associated with a known group that targets organizations like yours, it can help you prioritize that information. You can know what you need to go after first. So the first problem that we saw when we talked to a lot of retail organizations is when they thought they were getting threat intelligence, they were actually getting raw data, which made their situations even worse. But on the other part, they were also getting the intelligence or the information that they were getting was specifically tool-based. So it was information about a tool. Here's a signature about a tool, or here's an IP address a tool called out to, or here's a domain that a tool used. And having a tool-based intelligence is really missing the strategic and the operational aspect of what the attackers are doing. So we saw those were the two main issues when organizations were looking to involve threat intelligence into their security posture. So when talking with companies in a variety of different industries, and particularly in the retail area, there's usually 3 questions that these organizations want to know. When we talk to them about a threat briefing, or when these companies say, we're looking to get more information from an intelligence perspective, here's 3 questions that we want to know. The first question they always want to know is, how are attackers getting access to our network? In our industry or companies like ours, how are attackers getting access? And then the second question they have is, well, how are the attackers keeping access, or how are they maintaining that access, or how are they staying hidden on our network? Once they're in, what are they doing to stay hidden on our network? And then the third question is usually, why my organization? If it's a targeted attack, why specifically me? Or who are the groups or who are the attackers that we see specifically going after organizations like mine? So we'll break down each one of these and talk specifically for the retail section. So the first one, how are attackers getting access? So historically, if you look at any organization, there's 2 main ways that we see attackers getting access to these organizations. It's either web or via email. And from a web perspective, it's not necessarily just CNN.com where a large website is infected and anyone who goes to that website becomes infected. When we talk about web-based attacks, we're seeing more targeted attacks of a company outsources their HR, or they outsource their IT department. And that IT department or that HR department's website is infected, so now end users going to those websites are becoming infected. Or there's a conference that an organization supports or setups or it has a big part of, and those conference websites become infected, so that people who go to that conference website will become infected. So when we talk about web-based attacks, we're talking more of the specific targeted ones of a specific website being a targeted attack so that people that were going to those websites will become infected. So web is one of the main ways we see attackers get access to a network. The other one is via email. And email, the interesting thing about email is we're seeing an increased amount of malicious macros coming to end users. And macros, when a Word document comes in, a malicious Word document or Excel file or a PowerPoint, and when they open up that Word document, there's a macro that pops up and says, would you like to run additional content? And once the end users click on that macro and click OK, then the malware will go out and call out and pull down additional files or start pulling additional information. But it's really interesting to see how macros, which were popular a couple years ago from the attacker's perspective, had sort of died down, and now we're starting to see that wrap back up again. So some industry-specific information, when we see retail specifically, around 97% at one point in time of the attacks that we were seeing targeting organizations in the retail industry had some sort of email component in the attack. They were either sending malicious emails or they were using email to move within the network. And then you can see how that matches up to healthcare, which had around 97% of the attacks had some sort of email component. And from the finance industry as well, around 98% of the attacks that we had seen had some sort of email component. So the 2 main ways that we see attackers getting access to a network is either infecting a website and having people go to that website, a website that they would assume that their victims would go to, or sending a malicious email, and likely in recent times, most likely with a malicious macro to infect an end user. We're also seeing that around 78% of the observed phishing emails were either IT or security related, meaning they were either appearing as if they're coming from the internal IT department or they were targeting the IT department. So a good move is normally to target the IT department, get access to those organizations and users, and then start sending emails from the IT department of saying, here's a new VPN software, here's new certificates, and the attackers will actually send malicious files through those emails. But around 78% of the observed phishing emails we saw were either IT or security related to sort of get around the security processes put in place. So the main ways we see attackers getting access to the web and email, and you can get a lot of that information from a tools-based type of intelligence. You can find out, okay, how are they getting access to a network? What sort of vulnerabilities are they using? But the keeping access and how are the attackers maintaining persistence, this is really where you need to dive a little bit deeper into your intelligence and switch up a little bit more than just a tools-based intelligence. So what we had seen in the last couple of years, the median days from initial infection to discovery is decreasing. It was 146 days in 2015, which on the good side is down from 416 days in 2011. But still, 146 days is still an extremely long amount of time for the attackers to have access to the network. So meaning the attackers are getting in here, and it's taking around 146 days before someone is able to identify the breach. And with that amount of time, most of the time the attackers have taken the information that they needed. And the compromises that are being detected, we found that around 47% of them are being detected internally and 53% are being identified externally. So meaning that the external detection is either coming from the Secret Service or a bank or customers or journalists like Brian Krebs or the media or security companies. So 53% of the compromises are being detected by an external source. And I think that this is directly proportional with organizations only having a tools-based intelligence. They're looking for specific tools, and they're not able to identify those specific tools that they're getting intelligence on, so that the compromises are being detected 53% of the time by an external source. And one of the reasons why it's so difficult to identify this are statistics like this. Again, relying on a tools-based intelligence platform, you're going to miss how these attackers are moving laterally. So of all the compromised machines that Mandiant had identified in the last 2 years, and we like to think that from a FireEye Mandiant perspective, we respond to the breaches that matter. So of all the compromised machines we identified in the last 2 years, only around 50% of those compromised machines had malware on there. So compromised in the sense that the attackers have access to those individual machines. So only around 50% of them had malware on there. So if you're just relying on a tools-based intelligence, you're only seeing around half of the infections. And this is a reason why incident response within organizations is becoming so much more important. Because if an attacker has access to computer A and they get access via web or via email and they drop their tools on computer A, but then the attackers move to computer B, C, and D through legitimate credentials. If you're not doing incident response and you see the tool on computer A, you take computer A offline, you wipe it, you put a new operating system back on and put it back on your network, you're missing how the attackers have moved to computer B, computer C, and computer D. So it's interesting to see if of all the compromised machines, a tools-based intelligence is only going to catch roughly around half of the infections within a network. And so what we're seeing in trends from attackers, how they're maintaining persistence and how they're staying undetected on networks, is one of the first things that attackers are doing when they get access to a network is they're looking for those legitimate credentials. We're seeing a rise in attackers look for specifically VPN credentials. So they want to get the legitimate VPN credentials so they can look like a legitimate user. We see attackers get around single-factor authentication, but also bad two-factor authentication as well. So bad two-factor authentication in the sense of an organization has two-factor authentication, but if you need a new password or if you need a new PIN, you can click on a link and that it'll email you a new password or a new PIN. Well, the attackers have had access to the email account, so they're clicking on the new pins, they're clicking on the new buttons to get a new pin and a new password, and then they're able to get around two-factor authentication by stealing those passwords and stealing those pins and logging in, looking like a legitimate end user. But one of the first things that we're seeing from attackers when they get onto a network is they're looking for that legitimate access, and one of the main ways they're doing that is by looking for those legitimate VPN credentials. And the way that attackers are staying hidden longer is they're using more legitimate traffic and legitimate infrastructure to hide their noise. So historically, you would see an infection on an endpoint, and that malware would call out to a compromised server somewhere in the world to get instructions or to send the data out. But we had seen a group of attackers use Twitter, actually. So they had a handful of different Twitter handles set up, and in each one of those handles, they had a variety of posts. And in each one of those tweets, there was some encoded information. It looked like gobbledygook if you were just going to each one of these feeds. But actually what this was is any end users that were infected, the malware was calling out to these Twitter handles and reading that encoded information. And that encoded information was actually the next hop point of where the malware should call out to, or the next place that malware should go to. And sometimes that next place is an image site or a site like GitHub where it could download a JPEG file, and that JPEG file is actually a malicious executable. So if you're just monitoring network traffic, looking for signatures, or looking for information going to known bad websites, you wouldn't be able to detect this, because you would see an end user going to Twitter, an end user then going to GitHub, and an end user downloading a JPEG file from Twitter or GitHub. So we're seeing attackers use legitimate infrastructure for their command and control, and this is something that we anticipate will continue into 2016. So attackers are getting access. They're getting access to networks either via web or via email, and they're maintaining that persistence by trying to look like end users, either by going for legitimate credentials, most likely VPN access, or they're trying to hide in the noise of legitimate traffic, sending their traffic, their command and control infrastructure traffic out through Twitter, or through Microsoft TechNet, or through Facebook, or through a variety of other blog posts. But the last question that organizations always ask is they say, well, why me? From a targeted perspective, why is my organization being targeted, number one? And also, who are the attackers that we see historically going after organizations like mine? So when it comes to retail specifically, historically we have seen cyber criminals as being the main attackers that go after retail organizations. And of the different types of attacks, from cyber espionage, cybercrime to hacktivists, cybercrime is by far the most prevalent of all the different attacks that we see. So for example, from a FireEye perspective, we actively monitor the command and control infrastructure of over 100 different crimeware families. So families are variations of individual criminal type tools. And the command and control beacons that we're monitoring, we're seeing around 10 million different IP addresses every week. So the number of cyber criminals and cyber crime attacks is the vast majority of the attacks that we're seeing on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis. And of those criminal attacks, the cyber crime and the ones targeting retail organizations, the vast majority of them are opportunistic, isolated compromises, smash and grab. They want to get in and get out as quickly as possible. They're sort of walking around turning the door handles to see which one of these doors are unlocked. They want to get in, get as much information as possible, and get out. Although the vast majority of them are opportunistic, we have seen instances, which I'll talk about in a little bit later, of this opportunistic but leading to more of a targeted attack. So just looking for a vulnerability, finding a company that has a vulnerability, and then once they're in, turning that to a specific targeted attack. And now, while the overwhelming majority of the cybercrime attacks we do see are opportunistic, we do see a small subset that is more targeted, has custom-built tools, follow more of what people would consider a more advanced threat. It's not more of a smash and grab. They're more of a targeted-based approach, specifically going after retailers. But that's a smaller subset of the vast majority of the information that we see. And so some of the things that we're seeing currently and going into the future, I won't cover EMV too much. I'll let Glenn from Visa talk about that. They have much more of an insight and knowledge of of what's going on in that area. But the interesting thing is, as we're seeing the transition of more organizations go to EMV and chip sort of a payment process, we are seeing a rise of point-of-sale malware in a lot of the underground forums that we monitor. It's almost like the criminals are in a race to implement as much point-of-sale type malware and get that point-of-sale and credit card scraping as fast as possible to sort of get in before these organizations change over to EMV. So it's almost like a quick arms race to get as much POS, RAM scraping and credit card scraping information as they can before organizations really start to switch over. So we think that because of that, there could be an increase in the targeting of smaller merchants who maybe haven't switched over to EMV, or it's taking a longer time, or it's a little bit more difficult for them to switch over. It's really interesting to see sort of this arms race of the point-of-sale malware attacks going on within the underground forums. So Mandiant has done investigations on several major breaches. Some of you've heard in the news, some of them you haven't heard, ones that were targeting point-of-sale malware, and around 70% of the breaches that we're seeing were coming up from, were being involved through the compromise of remote access credentials, meaning the attackers were coming in and they were taking advantage of a third-party vendor or a contractor, and they were getting those remote access credentials. And again, being able to stay hidden because they were using legitimate credentials. And there was a small minority of attacks that we had seen targeting retailers and targeting point-of-sale systems that were using more traditional type tools. But the main ones that we had seen targeting point-of-sale malware were getting access via remote credentials. We also had seen remote credentials being one way. We've also seen a handful of organizations in retail being targeted by malicious emails from a spearphishing attempt to get access to the point-of-sale system. So in one particular case, we had seen a group of retailers and hotels targeted by these actors who were sending malicious emails who had a Word document attached to this file, to this email. And when the attacker or the end users were opening up this email, the attackers were using that to get access to the system and then move laterally throughout the network and look through and find out where the point of sale systems are located, steal that information, put memory scraping, memory dumping malware onto the point of sale system, take that credit card information offline, and sell that in the underground forum. But the interesting thing about this particular attack is these attackers were all using something called the Microsoft Word intruder. So basically this tool, it allows you to build malicious documents, and you can see what various CVEs it was exploiting. Build a malicious document, and then allows you to drop any tool that you want in there. So it's just taking advantage of these exploits, and then you could drop a variety of tools on there. A lot of the tools that these attackers were dropping on there, they were dropping tools that collect system information, any passwords that were on there, and basically turning the compromised host into a proxy. So the interesting thing about this is that this group was building these malicious documents via this off-the-shelf tool, this Microsoft Word intruder. And the people who were selling this Microsoft Word intruder, they were advertising this tool and talking about this tool as a potential APT type tool. So it was interesting to see this group specifically send these malicious emails with documents built off this Microsoft Word intruder. So of the organized financially motivated groups, there is a handful of groups that we've monitored that are more enterprise cyber criminals. They're more motivated on specific large-scale profit, large-scale dumps. They're not the smash and grabs. They're the ones who go in and take their time and get this information. And their life cycle, the way that they go after these organizations, is comparable to some of the advanced threat groups that you'll read about, whether it's nation state or some of these ones. They follow the normal advanced life cycle of custom-built tools, escalating their privileges, moving laterally, looking for misconfigurations of firewalls or servers or point-of-sale systems, stealing that information, stealing large amount of information, and then covertly extracting that group or covertly extracting that data. So here's an example of 4 or 5 different groups that we had seen, just so you get an idea of when we talk about a financially motivated group and how they differentiate between each other. Some of them specifically will target financial services. Some groups specifically target retail and financial services. Some target specifically hotel. And some of the ways that they go about stealing those information. So we talk about these targeted attack type groups. These are the groups that we're talking about. There's one group in particular, this group 2 that we'll call it for the sake of this webinar, was really active in targeting retail organizations, targeted some financial data, but also specifically in retail organizations. It was using custom-built backdoors, and it was this group, unlike some of the other ones that were using emails, this group was entering via SQL injection on some of the web servers. So following the attack lifecycle, you see the initial compromise, the attackers were getting access via SQL injections, looking for misconfigured SQL servers. And then once they were on there, they were deploying their backdoors, custom-built backdoors that allowed them the remote access, and they were encrypting their communications again, so it made it difficult for network admins to be able to identify malicious traffic going in or going out of their network. And then using password dumping, sort of some of the tools that we had talked about to escalate their privileges, to log in as legitimate users, looking for those legitimate passwords and those legitimate user IDs to look as legitimate users. And then they would do some internal reconnaissance. They would say, okay, what computers are talking to the point of sale systems? Which ones are talking to these financial areas? How can we do more recon of what does this network actually look like, so that when they go in and steal the information, they know what computers are the ones that should be talking to the point of sale system, which is the ones that should be talking to the financial areas, and how they can quickly go in and get the information and get out without causing any large alarms or making it look like it's illegitimate traffic. And then they would get around safeguards, so they would use encrypted communications, they would send information out via DNS. So again, getting around sort of a tools-based threat intelligence perspective. They weren't using a specific tool that had a signature, they were custom building their tools and using a variety of ways to get around some of the safeguards that these organizations had built. They would maintain their persistence by adding additional backdoors depending on where they needed to move throughout the network. And then when completing their mission, they were stealing account numbers and credit card data and moving that information out throughout a network. And sometimes encrypted FTP, they would send some out via encrypted DNS, but trying to get around the security tools that the organizations had set up internally. And so not all the cybercrime that we're seeing targeting organizations is looking solely for credit cards. We've seen other organizations being targeted where the cyber criminals are stealing intellectual property. They're looking to steal information about what a company is going to go public with, maybe new information about what this organization is going to be releasing, and then buy and sell stock based on that information. We also see organizations get targeted with commodity type malware, so things that you would normally think were banking trojans or sort of things that you would see every day targeting organizations. But then once the attackers have access to a network via these commodity tools, they'll actually sell off that information to other financially motivated criminals or some of those other groups that we're talking about. And then once those groups have access, they'll use their custom tools to move laterally throughout the network. So it'll look like just a commodity type tool, but once the attackers get access to the network, that's when they're using their custom-based tools to get around any of the tools-based intelligence or to get around the internal security tools of an organization. We're also seeing ransomware activity increase. You see the numbers based on 2015 really peaked in December. We'd seen it dip a little bit in January, but these numbers of ransomware and crypto locker and variations of that is increasing again in February, March, and April. So it's something that we anticipate organizations within the retail industry are going to continue to have to face into 2016. So the ransomware activity we don't believe is going to decrease anytime soon. So before turning it over to Visa, some of the things that we recommend for organizations when it comes to protecting their infrastructure: better protection against malware, looking into sandboxing technology, making lateral movement harder, so unique admin password or password vaulting, good two-factor authentication when it comes to critical systems, making it difficult for those attackers to get the login and passwords and look like legitimate users. But also there's some things you could do to make incident response easier. Things like having asset management, knowing where all the servers or knowing where the endpoints are within a network. So if there is a breach and an incident response team comes on, they know exactly what the network looks like, where the servers are, where the endpoints are, and it saves them a lot of time of having to figure out where all the different assets of an organization are placed. Centralized log management is another one, saving VPN logs, login logs, OS logs in a central place and being able to store that as long as possible so that if there is an incident response engagement, the IR team can go in there and quickly get an understanding of what had gone on within a network and maybe how the attackers had moved laterally using traditional Windows command line tools or using legitimate credentials. Another thing, large-scale packet capture. When we go down and we do an incident response, one of the first questions organizations ask is, was any data stolen or what data was stolen? So if we're able to do large-scale packet capture and look at almost sort of a DVR of over time of what network traffic has left an organization, we're able to understand what information has gone out, if the attackers had accessed any information, or if they've gotten access to a network but haven't stolen any information. Having that large-scale packet capture can go a long way to have an understanding of what information the attackers have stolen, if any. So that's the idea from a FireEye perspective. I'd like to turn it over to Glenn Jones now. Glenn, can you give us your perspective from the Visa side and what you guys are seeing when it comes to threats against retail payment systems?
Great, absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Kevin. Appreciate it. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Glenn Jones. As Sylvia mentioned earlier, I'm part of the Visa organization that has responsibility over threat intelligence and in particular breach identification. So my focus at Visa has been around those two areas for some time. So I'm going to give you a little bit of perspective from Visa's perspective, at least on the threats that we're seeing that are hitting the retail sector. Everybody knows the names of the retailers that we've seen breached over the last several years. We don't need to rehash those, but it's important to note that the threats against those retailers are still very real, and that's part of the reason why we're talking to you today. So I'll also talk a little bit about the lessons that we've learned at Visa from those breaches in terms of what the bad guys are now doing to get to the data, what they're doing to cover their tracks, and avoid detection, and what that means for breach detection for us at Visa as well. And also I'll go into a little bit about the reasons why we think the retail sector is a particular risk. And then finally I'll talk a little bit about why we think an Intel-led breach detection is the best way to prevent and detect payment data compromises. So getting started with a look at the compromise trends, this is Visa's view by merchant category. So what you're looking at here is the number of compromises that Visa has managed over the last several years from 2013 to essentially to present, 2016 year to date. And what we're looking at is the breakdown by merchant type. So you see, starting from the left there, restaurants, mostly in the lead, and then followed closely by retailers. So the retail segment, absolutely highly targeted, and in terms of the types of merchants that are compromised, still very much nearer at the top of the list. It's also interesting to note that looking within the retail area, look at 2016 compared with 2015. So the green bar compared with the blue bar. Retailer compromises so far this year have almost doubled. In fact, they have more than doubled what they were last year. So that's an indication that retail is continues to be a threat, and in fact is an increased threat as well. And there are a few reasons why we think this is the case. Number one being there's a huge universe of retailers within the U.S. market in particular. And I'll go into more detail as to what the particular threat is, not just with retailers, but with merchants in general in the U.S. market in a couple of slides. But just based upon the sheer number of retailer merchants as compared with other types in the U.S. market, we see that that is a driver behind why we have such a threat against retailers. The other issue is, particularly with high volume retailers, criminals are definitely looking for the exposure of the biggest amount of data, payment data, in the shortest amount of time. And we think that that is a huge driver. So is it a coincidence, for example, that the Target was compromised around the Black Friday timeframe, which coincided with peak shopping season? We don't think so. Is it a coincidence that Home Depot was compromised during what some describe as a peak shopping season for home improvement in the US? Probably not. So as we look back at retail compromises, a trend emerges. Criminals are not only targeting them continuously, but certainly particular threat groups are timing their attacks to coincide with peak transaction periods. And from their standpoint, why spend months trying to avoid detection after you compromise a merchant when you can get roughly the same amount of data over a period of weeks instead. So looking at why the threat exists, and this is a big piece of it, point of sale RAM scraping is something we've talked a lot about in the past, and there's a general awareness around, but in particular, this represents what some characterize as a flaw in the payment system. And the flaw is essentially that the payment data, the valuable data, the very data that the criminals are trying to steal, exists in the clear, meaning it's readable without any type of encryption or protection at a certain point in the stream of payment data during the transaction. And so in this particular view, when you swipe your credit card, there's authorization data, which is the data that's encoded on the back of the magnetic stripe, makes its way into the merchant environment and makes its way through there and goes to the banks. First being the acquiring bank, which is the merchant's bank, and then on to the issuing bank, the bank that issued the credit card through Visa or through another payment scheme, the payment mechanism as in another credit card brand. So this data is encrypted and decrypted at various points along the way. So for example, across the internet, it's encrypted. But the important piece here is within the merchant environment, the credit card processing application needs to be able to read the transaction data, which means it needs to process the data for the most part in the point of sale system's memory space. And within that memory space, RAM is the portion of the system that where the data exists in the clear. So lo and behold, point of sale RAM scraping malware has emerged over the last several years to sit in that space on a system and listen for credit card data. And what it does, there's somewhat sophistication behind that. Others, it's more rudimentary. I'll go into a little bit more about that in a slide or two in terms of how the malware operates. But that is the point of exposure that the criminals are exploiting now. Now, the other interesting note is that this particular vulnerability does not exist with EMV transactions or point-to-point encrypted transactions. But for merchants who have not yet adopted those, and Kevin mentioned this as well, we are now seeing a concentration of attacks and within those merchants and a concentration around the development and advancement of point-of-sale RAM scraping malware to target non-EMV types of merchants. Because again, the flaw exists and the data is available in the clear within those environments. So as far as POS malware is concerned, definitely there's this notion of the exposure of the data within the U.S. market in particular has given rise to a very robust marketplace and development effort around point-of-sale malware. So some of it is private use, meaning that it's in use by the authors itself. Others are more widely available and bought and sold on the underground within certain communities of cyber criminals. Essentially, you have the main two categories are the privatized and the commodity-based, and Kevin was talking a little bit about this as well. When we look on the left side here under some of the privatized malware, the first one that we list there, it looks like Captox. It's actually pronounced Kartosha. This is the infamous black POS that many folks have read about and learned about that is reportedly responsible for some of the large retailer compromises. What's interesting about this is that this particular brand or family of malware, every time it's encountered, is different. It's been customized a lot of times for that particular attack, for that merchant, and it is, although not entirely impossible, it is very difficult to detect. And that is just by virtue of the fact that there's a great deal of software development and concentration effort that's put around that, and it is actually by design that it's difficult to detect, and it's used for the most part for one-time use. And other aspects of POS malware that we're tracking involve some of the kind of the basic functionality that they all generally employ, independent of the particular family of malware, which is they collect data, like I was describing, from the memory on a point-of-sale system generally, or another system where payment data flows. Also involves keystroke logging, so capturing all of the keystrokes that the individuals within the merchant are entering into their keyboard. So this is a mechanism by which intruders use to expand their access. If an administrator or another individual with access to another system were to log in from a system that were infected with this type of malware, their credentials will likely be harvested and collected. There's also capability around data exfiltration, which is included in some of this malware. So it's sort of all-encompassing, multi-function type malware. And as far as data exfiltration is concerned, lots of times within the retail space in particular, we see that there's some very sophisticated capability within some of this malware to store stolen credit card information in encrypted or somewhat obfuscated data files. It includes mechanisms to time the exfiltration of the data. So in other words, rather than collecting information, stolen card information, and then just simply blasting it out to a command and control system or to a bad guy system on the internet somewhere, the transmission of that stolen data is deliberately timed to coincide with normal peak business hour traffic. So, for example, between the hours of 9 and 6 p.m., wherever the local time is. And the malware has the smarts to recognize what the time of day is. And if it falls outside that window, it'll sit dormant and wait for that period to appear. And then it'll continue its transmission of stolen card data. We also see very interesting things like code signing certificates for sale on the underground. And this is a mechanism that is used by some bad guys to securely sign their malware so that intrusion detection and some other security system technology has a much more difficult time in detecting it because it appears as though it's fully signed and trusted. And that's also some of the other capability. So in terms of payment data breach warning signs, and these are not unique to retailers, but we've drawn a couple of examples from some retailer compromises that Visa has observed over the past several years. These are some of the behaviors that we've observed that are on the left. Those are obvious signs, and you know, the first one being a little bit laughable because that rarely occurs, although it does, but it rarely occurs with some of the more sophisticated malware because again, they're designed to avoid the basic type of antivirus type of detection. So they're coded in a way and modified in a way to avoid that type of detection. So a lot of obvious signs there. When you see things like password cracking tools in your environment, that's fairly obvious. When you have an established network connection to Romania or Ukraine, those are things that should spark an incident responder's interest as well. But on the right side, there's also some not so obvious signs, and these are some of the more advanced IOCs or indicators of compromise that we see that really require some deep dive digging or some more deep intelligence on how this malware operates and how these intruders operate. So you can see, for example, some of the registry keys that are used to launch particular types of malware. And I think in this case, we're talking about POS RAM scraping malware. These are from a couple of events that took place, I think, a year or two ago. But events like new Windows services starting on the point of sale or new executables appearing on the point of sale as well. PS tools, if I could draw a big red circle around that, I would. PS tools is an actual legitimate set of network administrative utilities that in almost every retail case that we've encountered at Visa, this is a component. And what its use is, and Kevin mentioned this a little bit in his material, its use is to both expand access and to perform network reconnaissance within a breached environment. And PS tools is something that is legitimately used by network administrators and IT professionals as well. So it doesn't look like a virus. It doesn't look like malware. And that's the exact reason why the bad guys have chosen to use it, because it doesn't appear in any signatures. But however, if in the environments that are well monitored and well managed, where there's a healthy amount of vigilance, if you see PS tools being used and it's unexpected, as in it's not part of a normal IT function, that should be a red flag, and that should be something that's followed up on. So next, I'll talk a little bit about how we get threat intelligence and how we work with threat intelligence. In particular, this case highlights, what we're looking at here highlights the normal sort of conventional type of breach identification and threat intelligence that we go through. So in a lot of intelligence, in particular at Visa, comes from recognizing fraud patterns per transaction, things like that. So, you know, when you have something like your normal spend activity that occurs, outside of your either geographic location or a pattern that you've developed with your credit card bank, that's an alert, and there are controls in place, protections in place to protect you from being victimized by fraud, based in fact or based in part on those fraud patterns. What's important to note about those fraud patterns is there are some prerequisites there. And looking at the breach detection cycle, this is generally how it works with compromise detection. You have a cardholder who sees that fraud has occurred on his or her statement. They report this to their card issuing bank. And the card issuing bank then investigates the matter and tries to correlate among and across a number of cardholders to see if they can identify where all of those cardholders legitimately use their cards, and that is described as a common point of purchase. Once that analysis has been done, the issuing banks will then submit that report to Visa. Visa sets in motion a number of events which involves a compromise investigation, and we get the merchant involved, and their merchant bank is also involved. And very quickly, the merchant and or a set of incident responders detect a compromise and put down the compromise, and everybody goes on about their business. Well, what's important about this is there is a limitation with it, and that limitation is there is no fraud in every case. So, for example, what we have is very savvy cyber criminals who have compromised retail environments, and then rather than turning around immediately and selling that data on underground markets and this whole counterfeit cycle initiating, they hold on to the data. And they don't sell it, in some cases, for up to months after the compromise has occurred. So what we're left with is this fraud-driven type of intelligence is, although it's still valuable, it is somewhat of a lagging indicator for us. So what we do in response to that is we are focused now on a different type of threat intelligence to augment that particular type of threat intelligence. And what this is Visa threat intelligence, and it involves a number of different things. But primarily, Visa has always been the leader in securing the payment system. FireEye has always been the leader in cybersecurity. So essentially what we've done is we've combined those two sets of intelligence into one body of knowledge and one service for threat intel. And certainly it's no secret that cyber criminals have learned and improved their tactics over time, both to attack retailers and to monetize stolen data that results from those attacks. So as a result, compromises are definitely a little bit more difficult to detect and identify, and based upon fraud alone, it's far more difficult to detect these compromises. So what we've done is we're combining forces with FireEye, and we are detecting through cyber intelligence available in Visa threat intelligence. And it's basically everything that FireEye knows about the financially motivated cyber criminals. Kevin was talking about this, the fin groups that they're tracking, all of the details that they're able to amass with their intelligence gathering efforts about the financially motivated attackers, what their techniques are, the malware that they use, some of the targeted industries that they're going after. That's the FireEye input into the threat intelligence piece. The Visa input is all that we have learned and gleaned from breaches, payment system breaches over the years. And this has culminated in VTI, or Visa Threat Intelligence, like I've been talking about, and it really takes three different forms. It exists in the form of intelligence briefings, which are collected and curated types of intel. These are finished intelligence products that really lay out all of the techniques, tactics, techniques, and procedures that the financially motivated bad guys are using, the threats in terms of cyber threats and how they're materialized. This information is highly actionable, so it's not just the fact that these are observed tactics and observed threats, but these are, well, they're not just theoretical, they're actually practical. We've actually observed them in either the payment ecosystem or through FireEye's mechanism has observed them in their environment as well. Embedded in this also is this idea of indicator feeds, which is very unique within Visa Threat Intelligence and provides really actionable intel that can be ingested and used by security practitioners and incident responders to help prevent and detect compromises earlier. And this is basically just all of the indicators of compromise, both from Visa and FireEye, that we've seen in the payment ecosystem and that FireEye has seen in their intelligence network that is digestible and or ingestible to security systems like intrusion detection, prevention, firewalls, and SIMs and other things. So it is both automated and manual. So operates under an API so that, for example, a subscriber could subscribe to a particular feed. If you're a retailer, you can subscribe to a feed that involves just retail threats and others as well. You can see as Visa or FireEye observes a threat, an actual verified threat in the ecosystem or in FireEye's environment, this information through the form of IOCs is available to you to subscribe to and immediately incorporate into your own defenses. The goal here is to identify the breach before the fraud actually occurs. And that's what we think is driving this whole type of intelligence. And so also within the portal, there's a community circle capability, which is it's an invite-only type of function, and the platform supports having the VTI subscribers form alliances and form trusted partnerships within their own definition. So essentially you can, as a subscriber, you can create your own trust environment, share intelligence, share indicators, and discuss intel amongst yourselves without any outside eyes peering in. It's a trusted environment as well, and you're able to keep control and maintain control over those relationships, as opposed to what the current state of intel sharing often embodies, which is sharing it over email or over spreadsheets or something of the like. So that's what Visa Threat Intelligence is. And next, I'll quickly walk us through a quick use case. Again, the goal here with Visa Threat Intelligence is to give merchants the ability to identify the breach for themselves before fraud ever occurs, before it ever begins. And so, when a large victim a large retailer is compromised, as I was saying, all of the relevant information about the attack, the tactics that were used, the tools that were used, anything about the sources of the attack that are known are now available to other retailers to be able to detect and react to their own compromises, limiting the impact of a breach or even preventing it from occurring in the first place. And on top of that, all of the intel that the threat groups, about the threat groups behind the attacks that's collected by FireEye, all of this stuff now lives in one place. And so the case study that we're looking at here involves an actual case. This was a scenario that we encountered in a retail case from 2014. And the scenario has repeated itself over and over again. It's not just limited to this one case, but it is an example of how this type of intel is very instrumental in identifying compromises. So what we have here is Visa or FireEye staff, in this case, collected intel from an investigation in the field, a payment card data compromise, and discovered it, analyzed it, and sorted it, and then made that information available through the form of IOCs, indicators of compromise, to other potential victims. And then one of the victims in this case took a suspicious IP address and plugged it into their own security mechanism and was quickly able to identify that they had observed traffic to that IP address. So essentially they had identified one of the indicators that was very recent and very relevant from a prior case, but that indicator was used to detect their own compromise. And so what this amounts to is you have really an expediting of the time involved in payment data compromise, other types of compromises as well, but certainly payment card data compromises, that really shortens the amount of time behind when we have intel available and when that intel is usable by other merchants and other entities within the payment ecosystem. And so this was a success case for us, and certainly, like I said, this has repeated itself again and again, and this is the one of the main goals behind Visa Threat Intelligence, is to do exactly just this. So that is all that we have for the webinar. I'm now going to pass it back to Sylvia for a couple of final comments.
Thank you, Glenn, for that. I hope you all have enjoyed today's presentations. What we have right now on the slide, just two other things. If you want to see a demo, you can click on the YouTube to see how that works, as well as the Visa threat powered by FireEye link that's there just for additional information. We've got some speaker contact information on there as well, and if you have any additional questions, you can feel free to email Visa Threat Intelligence at visa.com. But again, thank you, Glenn and Kevin, for joining us today, and we will see you next time. Thank you.